the search for the author of the New York Times op-ed continues, some reporters are suggesting a particular word might help identify its writer. At the end of the piece, the op-ed's author wrote, quote, "We may no longer have Senator McCain, but we will always have his example, a lodestar for restoring honor to public life in our national dialogue." So it is the use of that word lodestar, which is defined as one that serves as an inspiration, model, or guide that some say could lead to the author. Joining me now from Washington is Jonathan Horn. He's a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. We were just talking about how people are poring over every word in this op-ed, looking for clues. So, Jonathan, is the word lodestar, which isn't commonly used in everyday conversation, a clue here?
I really don't think it is. It's a sort of a classic Washington buzzword, and it's a word that pops up on opinion pages of newspapers sometimes. In fact, I noticed it was on another New York Times op-ed of the same day. So for all you know, there's an editor at the New York Times who likes the word lodestar and put it into both pieces, or it's just very difficult to guess the origin of the word. And as I said, it's not normal in speech, but it is something you hear around Washington, which is a place where you often don't hear speech that sounds normal.
Well, you bring up a good point. This was an op-ed. Op-eds go through an editorial review. So can we also assume that some of it was edited?
I think you have to assume that the piece was edited. The piece itself read like it fit into the rest of the New York Times op-ed page. So I would think that someone guided the writer through that format and helped the writer make his or her message clear.
Which is going to make finding the identity of the writer all the more difficult. Now, as many people have pointed out, Vice President Mike Pence is known to use the word lodestar, and that has led to some of the speculation that he wrote the piece. His office, of course, denies that. What do you make of this speculation?
I think it's highly unlikely, and it's especially unlikely because of the way the author was described. I don't think the vice president would be described as a senior administration official. The vice president is an elected office. So I think that some other term would have to be used.
Now, you are a former speechwriter. Was there anything in particular in this op-ed that stood out to you?
What stood out to me, to be honest, was it was very informally written. It was very casual on a very grave subject. You're talking about putting your own decisions ahead of the President of the United States and in some ways working against what a person whose pleasure you're serving at. And it's an important point. People who are appointees of the president serve at the pleasure of the president. And there was a very informal, casual, almost breezy tone to the op-ed.
Yes, I agree with that. There was sort of a flippant tone that was a little surprising, certainly considering the sort of the weight of the topic for sure. Now, in an interview with NPR Thursday, David Frum, another former Bush speechwriter, said the anonymous op-ed is more than the typical Washington leak. Do you agree with him?
I think that's right. Typically with a Washington leak, you're trying to advance some policy, or maybe you're undermining a policy of the president's, but you're not coming out and saying, I'm trying to undermine my entire boss's agenda as this writer did. I mean, typically, or what you would hope, is if someone felt that they could not serve the president and did not support the president's agenda, they would resign and make their case to the American people. And if they have evidence of serious wrongdoing, would present that evidence to the American people. Now, that's not to say that an appointee of the president doesn't have a role to push back against the president. You certainly do, and especially in this White House, we need people to push back against the president more than ever. But that's different from taking a piece of paper off the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. If you're finding yourself doing that, your best option is to resign, go to Congress, talk to the press, make your story known, and show some principle.
Now, it's interesting because the New York Times says, if I'm correct, that the writer of this op-ed approached them and wanted this piece to be published and not vice versa. But I'm curious as to whether you think that this person might eventually reveal him or herself out of some, self-promotion.
Well, it is Washington, so self-promotion is obviously part of the game here. That would not surprise me, and to be perfectly honest, in the Trump administration, nothing stays secret for very long, so we can know the identity of this individual faster than any of us could ever assume.
Absolutely. So, Jonathan, from a historical perspective, because clearly you know a lot about presidential writings, are there any parallels to this from previous presidencies?
Well, if you go back to the very beginning of the country, when George Washington was President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, and he appointed a translator to the State Department with the understanding that that translator would start a newspaper that would be critical of the administration, full of anonymous articles attacking the administration. So we do have a long history, and if you go looking, you can find parallels for things, though nothing quite like this, I think, has ever happened.
Well, that is a fascinating piece of historical perspective. So, Jonathan Horn, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.